We're turning our attention to hurling. Sarah O'Donovan is with us. Sarah, good morning to you. How are you?
I'm good. We're back where we started, lads. This time last year, same semi-final pairing.
Before we get to that, right, because there has been some developments over the weekend with regards to the protests in the Camogie and the football, and I just wanted to and also the Cork dual players. So maybe we'll start with the protests. We were saying earlier on that it's time for the men to come out and help to throw their weight behind the women's protest. What's your instinct about that?
Sure, I saw Matthew O'Hanlon was the first tweet that came up on my Twitter account this morning. Matthew O'Hanlon, a Wexford hurler, saying we're all inter-county players, we all have to be treated equally. So I think the GPA juggernaut is kicking into gear now, and there will be an expectation that players in the GA will support their female counterparts. And if you see within the FAI and the steps taken by the male players led by Seamus Coleman to give the girls more money, I suppose that was the starting point, and that helped massively in the FAI. And from the male side of things, the likes of Conor Moyler, Matthew O'Hanlon, that's where I suppose the real pressure comes on the three organisations, the GA, the LGFA and the Camogie Association, because it's not just women asking for these basic minimum standards for female inter-county players. It's all sides now asking.
Yeah, you'd hope that the men row in really fast and everybody rows in behind, and they do something meaningful to help just elevate the level of conversation around the protests, because as Nathan was pointing out earlier on, the major TV audiences were for the men's sports last weekend, and while the pictures have gone around, the amplification of those pictures has been a bit less maybe than people would have hoped for. And Vicky Wallace talking to Sinead Kassan in the papers today saying it's going to ratchet up again unless something happens. So fingers crossed on that. On the dual players issue, Cork have Camogie and Gaelic football scheduled next weekend, basically for a couple of hours within each other. Is there anything that can be done here to fix this?
No, and look, I think from the male point of view, the dual player, is extinct, and because it's unsustainable. And I suppose from a female point of view, it has become unsustainable. And, last 2 weeks ago, you had a situation where Libby Coppinger played for Cork against Down, hopped into a car, drove to Galway, came on against Galway, having had that incredible afternoon. I would, as a player, her teammate sitting on the bench, watching her come on ahead of me, having done that, having played a match, having driven 3 hours, I would start to feel aggrieved about the conflict situation. But I suppose from my point of view, looking at it, standards needs to come up in both LGFA and Camogie. And right now for the dual players, if they're splitting their time across both codes, they're not able to give full time to their performances. Maybe we have to ask the question, is it unsustainable? And I think it is. So while the conflicts this weekend are obviously something that are an issue right now, I think for 2024 those players are going to have to ask the question. We are repeatedly being let down by our organisations. They cannot fit us in. Maybe we have to make the decision. And while that's incredibly tough, players within the GA have had to do it 2-3 years ago.
Yeah, I totally understand the point you're making, right? And at the same time, do wonder if maybe the two organisations are just being a little bit short-sighted, because if they were able to have the players play in both of them, they'd both get the reflected glory of having the best athletes playing. I understand the point you're making, but if they weren't scheduled at the same time, then there probably would be less and maybe Cork have organised it well, and so everybody understands that you are still doing all the physical stuff and you're doing skill in your own time. Maybe they haven't, and maybe some players are. There's a sense that some are swanning in, and I'm not specifically to Cork, but I buy the point that you're making, but at the same time maybe the organisations could try and facilitate them for as long as possible.
With the new split season, I think it's becoming more and more difficult. I think as well, scheduling the TV games and those games and the extra promotion, there's so many things at play here. And I think ultimately for the players involved, they're repeatedly being let down by both organisations, and then they're letting down their teams. And I know they're not doing that on purpose, Ger, but if you're playing a match on Saturday at 2:30 and you have to be in Galway at 7:00, that's unsustainable. Yeah. And that's for me, as a player playing on the Camogie team, I had Rena Buckley as a teammate, I had Bridge Corkery as a teammate, Elena Reardon. These were incredible inter-county players. At that time, there was lots of, I suppose, success, that's no question. And those are incredible teammates to have at that time. But right now, with the amount of training involved for both teams, I just don't think it's sustainable.
Okay, let's talk about the hurling then this weekend. We'll obviously have a chance to come back to the Camogie and the football later on. Where are Galway at after that performance of the weekend? Did they care about the wides and the slightly ineffective? Like, ultimately they're still alive and they have a couple of weeks to work through things, and they're going to be mad underdogs, and sure, doesn't that suit them nicely against Limerick?
See, that wasn't my take on the game at all, because I watched the game back again yesterday with the benefit of, I suppose, a bit of composure and calm around it. I had written Galway off. I couldn't see them beating Tip 2 weeks ago, and yesterday, incredible defensive performance, forward ticking over Conor Whelan, having the strength of two men taking on that Tipperary full back line, because obviously Henry Shefflin's decision making in game yesterday was the reason why Galway came out on top. That game was a masterclass from Shefflin. From the outset, picking Cathal Mannion to play as the seventh defender, opening up that space to be able to distribute the ball into the corners, to give Conor Whelan a chance to get on ball. I'm so impressed with what Henry Shefflin has done over the last 2 weeks, and considering the pressure that Galway were in and the way that Kilkenny won the Leinster final, I think it's opened my eyes to, I suppose, how much Galway have improved in the last 2 weeks.
It's funny, we were chatting to Anthony Moyles there, Sarah, before yourself. He was talking about the Galway footballers not having that, I guess, aggression and anger and doggedness maybe that you need to win big games. There seemed to be a little bit more anger from the Galway hurlers at the weekend than we've maybe seen in recent games. There's a bit more of that aggression. Yeah,
and look, for me yesterday, that was probably the most cohesive defensive performance I've seen across the championship so far this year. Darren Morrissey, Jack Grealish, Dahi Burke, Garrod McInerney, they were relentless in that opening 40 minutes, and I think Tipperary scored 6 points, to half time. That nobody would have, given that scoreline at half time. They ate Tipperary up. 2 inside forward players for Tipperary were taken off. Seamus Cannon was taken off. Keogh was taken off. Again, something I didn't envisage. Jake Morris couldn't get into the game. I think it took him until maybe the 50th minute to actually start motoring and finding space. Midfielders for Tipperary taken out of the game. Lads, everything that could have gone wrong for Tip yesterday went wrong, but that wasn't, I suppose, luck or an off day. That was the way Galway pressured the Tip players. They just, the ease which they kind of ran around the field against Offaly the week before, they came up against Galway and they were hit with a brick wall.
Talk to us a bit more about Shefflin. What has impressed you so much, and is it an evolution in his managerial career, do you think, or is it just that, like, the opportunity and the knowledge of his team is reaching a point now where he's more comfortable and fully understands exactly what they need to do and when they need to push and when they need not to push?
It was ice in the veins yesterday from Shefflin. You looked at the decision to start Glennon. Glennon empties the tank. Then Tom Monaghan comes in for that last 25 minutes, scores 3 points. Keenan Fahy at centre forward. I was so impressed yesterday. 2 brilliant assists for 2 scores in the second half. Really, really pressure scores where he wins the ball and he's popping the ball back out to allow the Galway players to take their points. That switch for Garrod McInerney, bringing him out late on when he was spent, and he brings in Fintan Burke. Fintan Burke goes out to right half back and wins a monster free, wrestles one of the Tip lads over his shoulder and lands on the ground. Conor Cooney coming in, and Jason Flynn, the last 10 minutes. The last thing Tip wanted to see, the last thing Michael Breen wanted to see was Jason Flynn coming in, ready to go at him for those last 10 minutes. It was a masterclass in man management and introducing a bench. We'd spoken during the League and Championship about Henry having an opportunity to see different players because the same pressure just wasn't there in the Leinster Championship. And you saw Liam Collins come on again late yesterday, and he's battling late on and he gets a couple of possessions. So for Henry Shefflin, I think yesterday was probably his best day as Galway manager.
Limerick will need a plan for Conor Whelan, won't they, Sarah? Like, it's got to that point now where he's having an impact on games. I know Dan McCormick started on him, I think, yesterday, but by the end of the game 2 or 3 Tipperary defenders had tried their hand. So I'm sure Limerick will have a plan, but like, based on his performances of late, he's tough to stop.
They've less of a plan. They've less options now, with Sean Finn out, with Declan Hannon out. You'd have assumed that Dan Morrissey would be at 3 and he would pick up Conor Whelan and it would be a right tussle, but now you're looking at Dan Morrissey going to 6 and Mike Casey possibly having to pick up Conor Whelan, and immediately I think there's a mismatch there because Conor Whelan is a block. His physical strength is incredible. So I think all of a sudden, with the absences within the Limerick defence, Conor Whelan's going to be a massive threat, and Galway have a chance.
In a similar vein to Shefflin getting the in-game stuff right, like, how would you assess Liam Cahill's decision making yesterday? Like, certainly the half-time team talk didn't work because they can see that goal straight away in the second half, but there just seemed to be a number of matchups, as we say, and that's just one of them that we've spoken about, but matchups that they got wrong, maybe Tipperary.
I was a little surprised that Seamus Callan started. Maybe Garrod O'Connor was injured, but I just felt that Garrod O'Connor's form, through the last, say, 8 to 10 weeks merited him starting. I think Callan would have been better coming on in the same way that Jason Flynn was coming on late for Galway. I don't think Tip had that impetus off the bench to come in. Johnny Ryan came in, scored a point obviously late on, but Callan in those last 10 minutes would have known what was needed, and I think that was one mistake that he made. Alan Tynan worked really hard but ran out of steam. He's not the guy you want to see going off in the last 5 minutes. The midfield for, I suppose, Tip, I just felt they looked tired, and you're scoring in excess of 40 points last week against Offaly. It doesn't look like it's affected you, but evidently it does, because you've got 70 more minutes in your legs than Galway had. So from Tip's point of view, they will be very disappointed with the showing yesterday. And as much as I love hearing tip, I I won't miss it for the last 2 games, and I think Galway were fully deserved with that game yesterday.
So the way you're seeing it then is they actually have a load of room to improve, and they've got the bones of a system in place. Everybody understands exactly what they're doing. They've got a management team who are starting to be in their bag of tricks, and they had 18 wides and a lot of goal chances. So you can easily see them putting up a big score against Limerick and actually putting it to Limerick, giving them their fill of it.
Our only issue all league and championship to date was that their distribution to the inside line was so poor, but sitting Cathal Mannion where they sat him yesterday, and the distribution yesterday was so good for Galway that I think they've finally locked the door for that inside line. And even the players who came on, Conor Cooney, Kevin Cooney was brilliant yesterday. Like, their attack was motoring finally, and Evan Nyland, I'm naming players here who just got into the game yesterday and did so well, and backed up by that incredible defensive display.
Let's talk about the Dubs and Clare. Like, I think if you were Dublin, your hope was that Clare would somehow feel a hangover from the Munster final defeat in the way that they had done last year, and that you needed to somehow put a little bit of doubt in their minds, and you needed to hope that Tony Kelly was going to have an off day. Everything you hoped for disappeared in a 3-minute puff of smoke just before half time with a 3-2, like an incredible scoring burst that decided the game. Yeah,
I watched that game back as well yesterday, because I felt I was doing Dublin a disservice if I didn't actually look at what they got right. So I was on to Ray Boyne yesterday and asked him to have a look at the stats for the midfield, because I felt that's where Dublin lost the game. They tried a number of things. They brought Dara Power out to midfield to try and track Ryan Taylor. Obviously Chris O'Leary was in midfield with Mark Rogan, and ultimately, the experience of Cathal Malone, I think he had 19 possessions. David Fitzgerald had 16 possessions. It was such a dominant midfield display from Clare, and this put massive pressure obviously on the Dublin half back line. Conor Burke at centre back for Dublin, spoke about him in the league. I felt that he loves going forward, but not necessarily the most solid at 6 when they're obviously under pressure, and that was evident yesterday. Again, I looked at him yesterday afternoon and what he did, in terms of the positive things. I can see why Michael Donoghue has him at 6. His distribution is incredible, and when he's feeding the likes of Danny Sutcliffe, who had a brilliant game in terms of possession winning yesterday, wasn't necessarily that great in front of the posts. I think he had 4 wides. Paul Crummy, and the ball that was being delivered into Paul Crummy, and the ball that he was winning, Cian O'Sullivan, the ball that he was winning, that is because the distribution for Conor Burke was so good. But when the tide turned and Clare were coming at Dublin defensively were, they were so leaky. There were so many gaps. They didn't know how to defend the pace, the acceleration, and Dave Fitzgerald, the pace coming through the middle, they were unstoppable. So I've positives and negatives for Dublin. There's work-ons for Micheál O'Donoghue, but ultimately when you're moving Eoin O'Donnell, you're all-star fullback from fullback in the second half to try and win a game. I think that's where Micheál O'Donoghue's probably man management or in-game management wasn't as sharp as, say, Henry Shefflin yesterday.
Yeah, because that space through the middle, Sarah, I mean, you can talk to the cows come home about the class of Tony Kelly and the 5 goals that Clare scored, but as you say, the ease with which they were able to get through for some of those would certainly lead you to question Dublin.
Yeah, like Conor Burke actually got fouled after 4 minutes, he picked up a yellow after 4 minutes. He fouled John Conlon coming through, a heavy hit, and maybe that led to him saying, okay, I need to stay on the field here, and you're kind of jumping out of tackles that you might have to go into, but that he definitely had to go into. So I can see the point there where possibly he wasn't the right man to be trying to stop an in-rushing player because he was on the yellow. But I think from the point of view of Dublin's defensive 6, they just weren't organised enough for that team, and that comes back to the midfield, the amount of ball, like 16 possessions for Dave Fitzgerald, 19 possessions for Cathal Malone. They were ticking right to the end. Interestingly for me, Tony Kelly stays on until the 68th minute, and he's a big game in 2 weeks. I'd have been shuffling him off the field now after 40 minutes and putting him in cotton wool. I think obviously Shane O'Donnell came off late on, looked like he needed a bit of a rest. There was a lingering injury there perhaps, but with the war of attrition that is hurling, and the players that are out at the minute for Clare, I'd have definitely been minding Tony much earlier than the 68th minute. We
do obviously still await news from the Kilkenny camp, and I suspect we won't know the truth of any of the stuff that's coming from the Kilkenny camp until the ball gets thrown in, and maybe even until the second half if some of the injured players are coming off the bench. So while Clare are concerned, obviously they had injuries last year ahead of the semi-final, it feels like they're in a much better place than they were heading into last year. Like we incorrectly thought that they were going to give Kilkenny their fill of it in the semi-final, and they just disappeared on the day. That's surely not going to happen again this time.
No, I think this Clare side is much better organised, and even yesterday, with the fact that Aidan McCarthy couldn't start, Mark Rogers steps into the breach, and Mark Rogers scores 111 yesterday. I know the lads in the Sunday game were trying to decide who should get player of the match, Tony Kelly or Mark Rogers, and I'd have given it to Mark Rogers yesterday. He was so consistent and so composed. So I suppose Aidan McCarthy has an opportunity now to get well. He's got 2 weeks ahead of him. Dave McInerney, John Conlon. I don't know if Conor Cleary will get back in time. That would be the one issue. But I suppose I was actually very impressed with Darragh Lohan yesterday, Brian Lohan's nephew. I thought he gave Danny Sutcliffe a world of torture. So I think Brian Lohan probably has options, but I would very much fancy Clare now going into this Kilkenny game. I think they have a point to prove. I think they let themselves down badly last year, and for them the Munster final was a game that got away. It's not a game that they emptied the tank in, and were unlucky not to win. The Munster final 3 weeks ago was a game they let get away, and I think mentally they know they have a point to prove.
Who is playing in the final?
Limerick Clare.
There you go. All right, good stuff, Sarah. Thanks a million.
Thanks, lads. Have a good day.